In this video, I'm going to be talking about exactly how focal length affects our images. What's up YouTube, and welcome back to my channel. On this channel I talk about everything photography, so if that interests you then click subscribe down below. This video is going to be all about focal length, and first of all let's talk about what focal length is. Focal length is measured in millimeters, and it's not the size of the lens. What it is the distance between the camera sensor and where all of the light converges inside the lens. A 24mm focal length will have a distance of 24 millimeters between the camera sensor and where all of the light joins in the lens. But that's enough technical stuff for now. What we really need to know is how focal length affects the images, and for this I set up two different tests. For these tests I'm using a 24 to 120mm lens to give a really nice variety of what focal lengths we can use. For this first test, what I did was keep the camera in exactly the same place, the subject in exactly the same place, and I just changed the focal length to give us an idea of exactly what's going to be changing. So the first image we've got here is shot at 24mm. This is as wide as this lens will go. And then we've got 70mm. This is kind of in between on this lens. And then last but not least, we've got 120mm, and this is as zoomed in as this will go. Looking at these three images next to each other, it's quite clear to see what everybody associates with focal length is the bigger the number, the more zoomed in the picture is. Another thing that's going to affect your focal length is your camera body. So these images were taken on a full frame Nikon camera body, so that's a crop sensor of 1. So we times 50mm by 1 for a 50mm lens. If you're using a crop sensor, your focal length is going to change slightly depending on what camera you've got. So a Nikon crop sensor is 1.5. So a 50mm lens will be times by 1.5 to create a lens of 75mm. A Canon is 1.6, so that 50mm lens is going to give it a crop sensor times 1.6, so that will be 80mm. If you're not sure what your crop sensor is, then just take a look on Google and it will let you know if you Google what type of camera you've got. Now I'm going to get into test 2, and for this one I wanted to see what else changes other than the zoom when we change our focal length. So I kept the cake the same size in each picture. I changed the focal length and I changed the distance between the camera and the subject to make sure the subject was the same size in each picture. That's all I changed. All the settings and the subject stayed the same. Now we've got these three images next to each other and the cake is the same size in each picture. It's really obvious to see that it's not just how zoomed in or how big the subject is that changes when we change our focal length. One of the biggest differences when we change our focal length is the compression that happens in the image. When we take the image at 24mm, we're seeing a lot of the background. We're seeing a really wide area of the image, which is why it's called a wide angle focal length. We're seeing all of the edges of the background, even though the background is the same size and at the same distance from the subject in every single image. In the 70mm one, we can just see the edges of the background, so it's still a bit wider than what we would want ideally to take this picture. And then if you look at the 120mm image, we can see none of the edges of the background. What's happening here is compression in an image. So when we use a longer focal length, that's a more zoomed in focal length, it compresses the image in and it brings everything a bit closer in the image, even if it's the same distance in all three. Another thing that changes is the perspective. So if you look at the napkin in the 22mm one, it looks a lot longer and a lot bigger, like it's coming a lot further forward than it does in the 70mm and the 120mm. This is just distortion in the lens because both of those other images had the napkin in exactly the same place. Another way you can see the distortion is if you look at the chocolate chips. They sort of look like they're falling off the image slightly, and then if you look at the 120mm one, it's dead straight, it's standing upright, it doesn't look like it's about to fall over. We do have a few tricks to fix these distortions, such as Lightroom and just maybe tipping it into the image so it looks like it's standing up straight. But a lot of the time it's easier to just use a more zoomed in focal length. The amount and type of distortion that happens with a wider lens will change with every single lens you use. It's not the same. Sometimes it will also happen when you zoom in too much. It can start to do the opposite. So this is something to always remember when picking your focal length. This distortion is usually why we don't use wide angle lenses in food photography. It's always nice to make sure everything's looking right and we've got no distracting angles. Another reason we like to use a more zoomed in focal length, it gives a lot more background blur. So all three of these images are shot with the same f number, so the same aperture, yet the amount of blur and softness in the background changes quite drastically. On the 22mm one, the whole background is pretty much nearly in focus. I mean, it's not perfect, it's not sharp, but you can see what it is. Looking at the 120mm one, the background that you see is a lot blurrier, it's a lot softer, and this is quite an aesthetic look in food photography, and it's something a lot of us try to achieve. So having a much more zoomed in lens is a really good way of achieving this without too low of an f number. So when we're thinking about what focal length we want to use, there's no right or wrong answer for what's the perfect focal length. There's so many different situations where I would be using a wide angle lens, and when I'm shooting overhead, I don't tend to zoom in very far because I can't get onto the ceiling. So I'm normally using a 40 to 70mm focal length for an overhead flat lay shot. And if I'm shooting straight on or at a 45-degree angle, I'm usually shooting between 85mm to 100, so 120mm. However, when I'm doing real estate photography, I'm always using a focal length of 16mm, so that's very, very wide. So there's no good or bad focal length. It's completely dependent on what situation that you're shooting in. That's it for this video, guys. I hope it was helpful. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If there's anything that you'd like me to discuss, then just let me know in the comments below and I'll definitely get around to making a video on that. Thank you, guys. I'm usually shooting between. That's it for this video, guys. That's it for this video, guys. And if it's really helpful, then give it a thumbs up. And if you want